Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Peinecker, and I have this really cool panel of guests, and there's a possibility we might even have a couple more jump on. But before we get there, I just want to remind you, this month's book giveaway is Unexpected. There you go. The backstory of finding Elizabeth Smart and growing up in a culture of an American religion by Chris Thomas, forward by Elizabeth Smart. Excuse the glare there. In the description, those of you who'd like to enter the book contest, just email me at mormonbookreviews@gmail.com and put in the subject heading book contest and give me your name and address. U.S. residents only. This is the May book drawing. So, and we've had Chris on. This was a great interview and a great book, by the way, Rebecca. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, it was amazing. I recommend this book to absolutely everyone, and Chris is wonderful too.
It's actually one of the top-selling books in the Mormon category on Amazon, so it's been doing very well. So I'm very excited because we want to have this conversation. A lot of things have been happening, a lot of contention, and we're all kind of people that are out there in the public square as well. And we've also recently had a speech from President Nelson in which she talked at General Conference about how we should be peacemakers and not people of contention. And we're actually going to play a clip. Before we do that, Rebecca, I want you to kind of introduce yourself, because you're here not as Rebecca Bibliotheca, my co-hostess with the mostest. You are here as the podcaster Mormonish. Talk a little bit about what your project is all about and how you're trying to contribute to having constructive conversations as opposed to contentious ones.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Steve. It is very different not to be your co-host. I feel like I need to jump in. I need to start talking to the guests, but I'm not going to. I'm just a panel member right now. So yeah, I mean, I am, of course, on the post-Mormon spectrum. And as a co-host to Steve, I really enjoy all of our conversations across that spectrum. I mean, you and I, Steve, have interviewed, faithful Mormons, post-Mormons, fundamentalist Mormons, never Mormons. It's just wonderful to me to be able to talk to all these people with all the different perspectives and have these civil, interesting, wonderful dialogues that we've had. So in addition to helping out Steve sometime as a co-host, for the last 3 years, I've also run a virtual national book club called The Good Book Club. And our members are post-Mormons, nuanced Mormons, never Mormons. We do even have faithful Mormons that attend, and we discuss books through the lens of Mormonism. And we have a lot of really interesting conversations that come up around that. And it's been fascinating to see through the catalyst of literature how you can have these conversations and these dialogues with people with different points of view. Now, we've had some times where maybe there's some conversation that gets a little heated, and we try to Steve was part of one of those once with a post-Mormon who was very triggered by something Steve brought up, but the whole group kind of smooth everything down. I was really proud to see that. It didn't escalate. Everyone worked together to sort of bring things down and arrive at a place where we could all continue talking. And this has been going on for 3 years. We have members all over the country, and we just love it. It's a wonderful place to understand each other in, and that's a virtual book club. And then in addition to that, just recently, last fall, I launched a podcast with the person that I co-founded the book club with, Landon Brophy. He's also a post-Mormon and is called Mormonish. And we kind of explore what people are doing on the other side of Mormonism. Now, that can mean that you're a nuanced or a progressive Mormon and you look at Mormonism maybe in a different way. So we do a weekly podcast where we just talk to guests about different things in the post-Mormon world with what I would like to think a very respectful, a very positive point of view. In fact, a funny story, when we first started, we're kind of like a Regis and Kelly, we sit there and we're very smiley. We had some comments that said, "Oh, I know you're trying to trick us. You guys are too happy to be post-Mormons. You guys are Christian, aren't you? So about episode 5, you've lured us in, then you're going to spring all this evangelical stuff on us, aren't you?" And then ironically, episode 5, we did have Steve on. So I mean, it was nothing like that, But again, suspicion, right? Simply because I'm a smiling person means I have an agenda. I'm trying to push something. I'm not. I like to get to know people. I like to understand where they're coming from. And that enriches my life too. So that's why I convinced Steve to put me on this panel, because I'm very interested in talking to people. And I also have thoughts and feelings on what's happened in the last couple of weeks. After President Nelson's wonderful talk, which I thought it was a wonderful talk, I sent Steve the clip. I said, we have to play this. And I've been disheartened to see some of the things, the way I might interpret them that have happened in the last couple of weeks that maybe we'll talk about. So anyway, that's me.
That's great. That's awesome. Greg, I'm so glad you came on the show today. This is Greg Matsen of The Quick Show. And actually got great feedback from people when I came on your program, and then also a ton of people have been watching my interview with you. And I just really appreciate, one, the work that you're doing with Jeff McCullough as well, because you're also building bridges with the evangelical community, which I think is really important. You even spoke at an evangelical conference. So you're actually kind of being a peacemaker to evangelicals in many ways, and I'm a peacemaker to the restoration. And just talk a little bit about your channel, kind of what you're trying to accomplish, and also maybe comment about this kind of unique thing that you got going with Jeff and other evangelicals as well.
Sure. So Quick Show is basically a faith-based podcast. It is in support of the church. It's in support of the brethren, but I also am somewhat bold on coming out on certain issues that I think are a problem. And that's not in undermining anything with the church, but especially the culture is what I would say, right? The culture within Mormonism, I talk about that quite a bit. And so anything that has to do with the culture that affects the culture of the church, that's going to be probably a topic that I'm going to cover. I also do a lot on the scripture side. I'm about to finish my first book, which is called The Interpreters, and that is a book on scripture study. And then the second book, which I've already started to write, is going to be on something to the effect of the philosophies of men. And so we get into a lot of philosophy and how that's affected and conflicts with some of the gospel. And then there's interfaith, right? There's something that's very important to me. So I've got good friends that sit on the synod of the Bishop of Canterbury in the Church of England. I speak with them quite a bit. I've got friends at the SBC. A lot of people know me from Jeff McCullough and speaking with him and trying to create a relationship there. I've gone to church with Jeff. I haven't put that episode out yet, but I went to church with him a couple of weeks ago, worshiped with him at an evangelical church, met the pastor there, went to lunch with the pastor. And that's a very interesting world, right? I have this discussion a lot with Jeff. It's, you kind of ride the edge of the sword in this world, because on my end I have those that, well, let's just say for the most part they're going to lean pretty far more to the right, that are within the church, and they're going to have much of a more of a defense. It's this isn't just a political left and right, it's a psychopolitical type of a thing, and so it's you're gonna circle the wagons a little bit more, and there's many that are saying, why are you doing this? Why would you do this? He's a wolf in sheep's clothing. And then on the other end, of course, I've got the evangelicals that are attacking me, telling me I'm a member of a cult and they don't believe, I don't believe in the right Jesus and all these other things. Well, of course, Jeff's going through the same thing, right? He's got evangelicals that are attacking him. Why are you even opening up the Book of Mormon and giving it any credibility? Why would you even look at that? And then, of course, he's got Latter-day Saints that are attacking him, that are saying, again, you're a wolf in sheep's clothing, which he is not. And so anyway, he and I have developed a very good relationship. I've spent time with him and his wife. I've met his kids. I've gone to meals with him several times. And that, I do believe, is peacemaking. I want to go further on this podcast down the road here. I want to talk a little bit more about that. But I think interfaith is a very big deal. I think building bridges is important.
I think so too, and I really commend you. And of course, you've also had David Boyce on of 52 Churches to 52
Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Another evangelical homie who's really
Derwin Gray from the Transformation Church in South Carolina. I've had him on as well.
Oh, great. I'm so happy to hear that. And I think that's so awesome. And you have the right spirit, and I really appreciate that. But you also have your principles, and you're going to stand for them. And I think that's a great thing to do. And speaking of somebody who stands up for himself a lot, recently, Jim Bennett, it's kind of interesting because we're also going to talk about Patrick Mason and the situation where he, with the podcast, that he attempted to do something like having conversations, and it kind of was short-circuited. But you've also kind of been attacked by people as well recently, and it just kind of saddens me to see that, because a lot of these people are even mutual friends, and it just saddens me to see this kind of contention happening shortly after the prophet goes and says we shouldn't be doing the contention stuff, right? Well, we're going to play a clip of the President Nelson in a bit, but Jim, why don't you talk a little bit about kind of what your travails and what you've been going through. And of course, you were on Mormonism Live recently as well, talking about
I was on Mormonism Live just a couple nights ago, and it was just a lovely discussion. I really enjoyed it. And we were discussing the discussion I'd had on Midnight Mormons, which I was actually on twice in the last couple of weeks. And the first time was kind of lovely. But at the very end of it, I stepped in it and beat up on somebody who was Desnat, Deseret Nation, this sort of undercurrent through the church of people that are trying to purge the church of people like me who are not sufficiently ideologically pure. They use very violent imagery to do it. And then they went on to make this meme that involved Porter Rockwell metaphorically pointing a gun at me. And I took issue with that. And they brought me back on to try to sort of find middle ground. Well, gee, you need to understand that you're just old, Jim. You just don't realize that all the kids these days make memes with guns in them. And so it was a very interesting thing for me, because what we're going to talk about with regard to contention, I also felt like you're not doing the church any favors by excusing awful, terrible behavior. And there's an undercurrent within the church that engages in what I consider to be awful, terrible behavior. So yeah, that's what's bubbled up in the last little while. But what I've been doing lately, and Stephen, we just had a conversation with you just a couple days ago, but I teamed up with a guy named Ian Wilkes that none of you have ever heard of, but he was a missionary with me in Scotland in 1980, and he was a bishop, stake president, wonderful, has a magnificent conversion story, and then actually ended up leaving the church. And he approached me. I'd not done the kind of podcast you've done. I'm looking at your lighting, and you guys have better mics. And I'm like, wow, I need to learn from these guys. But he said, I want to do a podcast with you, Jim, because you're still on the inside of the church. I'm now on the outside, but I still care about the church and care about the church's future. And we want to sort of model the kinds of discussions that people on the inside can have with people on the outside. We're trying to do what I think Patrick Mason, John Dehlin, and Jana Reiss were trying to do. So that's kind of where I am and where I'm focused at the moment.
And you kind of put it out there that you'd be willing to take Patrick's place on that weekly program too, right?
I did. I even texted John and said that, and got a nice text back, but it hasn't gone anywhere. I'm nowhere near in Patrick's league in terms of academic credibility. I certainly don't have Patrick's reach and scope, but I very much appreciate what he was trying to do, and it's what I'm trying to do. And so, I don't want to put John Dehlin on the spot, but yeah, I would like to see that conversation continue, because I respect John Dehlin and Jana Reiss immensely, and think that that's something that needs to continue.
Yeah. So let's listen to the President Nelson, what he had to say about this. And I want to share this, do the share screen here, and pull this up. And we are going to, and just let me know if you guys can hear it. We did an experiment, and it should be ready to go. So here we go.
If a couple in your ward gets divorced, or a young missionary returns home early, or a teenager doubts his testimony, they do not need your judgment. They need to experience the pure love of Jesus Christ reflected in your words and actions. If a friend on social media has strong political or social views that violate everything you believe in, an angry, cutting retort by you will not help. Building bridges of understanding will require much more of you. But that is exactly what your friend needs. Contention drives away the Spirit every time. Contention reinforces the false notion that confrontation is the way to resolve differences, but it never is. Contention is a choice. Peacemaking is a choice. You have your agency to choose contention or reconciliation. I urge you to be a peacemaker, now and always. Brothers and sisters, we can literally change the world, one person and one interaction at a time. How? By modeling how to manage honest differences of opinion with mutual respect and dignified dialogue. Differences of opinion are part of life.
So
If a couple in your ward gets divorced, or a young missionary returns home early,
we'll get that taken care of.
or a teenager,
So good, we have to hear it twice.
Have to hear it twice. There we go. Sorry about that.
I just want to say, when he said that sentence, I'm a member of the Tabernacle Choir on Temple Square. And that first sentence in the clip you shared, I got in trouble because I said audibly, "Thank you." And everybody around me turned around and, Jim, you're not supposed to do that. But I just was so thrilled when he said that. And I was so thrilled with that talk. It's easily the best talk he's ever given. Certainly one of the best talks I've ever heard at conference from anybody.
Yeah, I am just like I was really impressed. And what was really cool was shortly after that was aired, the Backyard Professor went on his show, which he's part of the Mormon Discussions umbrella, and really took heed and said, you know what, I'm going to follow the prophet. And here you had Harry Schurz, who's formerly helped start Fair Mormon. Now he's on the outside, but he went through his angry atheist phase. Now he's back to maybe he's more wants to do reconciliation and bridge building himself. So he said, I'm going to follow the prophet because I think the words he said were very, I want to follow that. And I think that's great. And so actually, and then Carrie and I, we taped an episode last weekend talking about that. And that's the thing too, folks, of course, I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and I've had the reputation of being the Switzerland of Mormonism. And it just kind of happened naturally and to me, it's like, this is so easy. 90% of the time I have a guest on my program, I probably disagree with them because we come from different worldviews, but that does not mean that we cannot be civil. And I've been modeling this behavior, just like the prophet has said to model it. Carrie and I talked about the importance of modeling this behavior. If Jonathan Neville's able to hop on, he's in Eastern Europe, so we're hoping he's able to come on. He's running late because, of course, he's been the victim of a lot of attacks from people as well. But he's actually got this new blog called nomorecontention.org, I believe is the name of it. I'm going to leave links in this description. And so that's an important project that he's doing as well. But, I wanted to talk a little bit about, Rebecca, you had mentioned you had watched the speech this morning and you actually printed out the entire speech because you felt there was a lot of good stuff in there. Maybe just kind of talk a little bit about how important that speech was to you, especially here you are, you're a post-Mormon, but you have a son that's currently serving a mission. You're still very much plugged into the world that you grew up in.
Absolutely. And that's why I refer to myself as a post-Mormon. I care very much about the church and the future of the church, to quote Jim, if I think that's what you said. And it's true. I have a missionary son, I have a faithful Mormon son, and I have another son that's out. So believe it or not, I watched all of conference. Post-Mormons do watch conference. I believe there's truth in many different places. And I, like Jim, I was able to say very loudly when I heard the words he was saying, yes, yes, I was saying that to the TV because absolutely. And I was really impressed with how fervently he gave this talk. He wasn't just kind of saying, oh, yeah, you've got to be nice. He said things in the talk like, listen to me, hear this. When your prophet says directly to the camera, hear this, you better sit up and look and see what he's trying to say, because he doesn't always say that. He gives some nice addresses. But to me, I took this that he felt very passionately about this. And I think a lot of post-Mormons felt that way. And they thought, this is great. We need to take that to heart too. A bridge goes two ways, and faithful Mormons need to take it to heart. And hopefully we can all learn, because I always feel that President Nelson he's talking to post-Mormons. I feel that he has things to say to us too, that we can learn and use in our lives. So I look at it both ways. So to me, I was very I was excited about the talk. I felt like there might be a change in the wind. That is actually how I looked at it, and how some of my other, friends looked at it too. And then I know we'll get into it later, but then events in the last month, I think, made all of us go, oh dear, oh dear. And again, probably a trickle down sort of a situation. You can say something at the top, but does that mean that certain individuals adhere to that? And that was the other key that I loved. I was nodding my head during the part of that clip where he said, one individual interaction at a time. And that is really where it's at. I mean, we can't change the world. Some of us can more than others with bigger platforms, but just one interaction, you and someone else, and it trickles out from there. And I think he was trying to make that clear to everyone. It doesn't matter how your neighbors are reacting or how your friends are interacting. What about you? Can you do something where you have less contention or build a bridge? And so that's why I've listened to this talk multiple times and printed it out and printed out some quotes, because I just think it's wonderful. And it's a great springboard to use today to talk.
I think it's wonderful that you can find wisdom in President Nelson as somebody on the outside. And I think that's really cool.
Of
And
course.
Jim, your co-host, when I interviewed him, talking about the trickle down, your co-host Ian made the comment that there's a lot of things that are said at General Conference, but they often don't make their way down into the ward level. Maybe talk a little bit about that because I thought that was a really interesting insight he gave.
No, I think that's true. It's very easy for conference talks to sort of come and go and not leave a mark. And some of that has to do with the talks. Some of the talks are frankly forgettable. I actually, sitting through this conference, sitting in the choir loft, I'm there live for a good chunk of it. And President Nelson didn't speak in the initial sessions. He didn't speak Saturday at all. And that seemed unusual. And I thought, okay, well, this is kind of a forgettable conference, frankly. There's just not much happening. And then when President Nelson spoke, it was just pure fire. And I went, it's going to be very hard for members to ignore this talk, or for this talk not to have some kind of impact. Although at the same time, there's no guarantee that it's going to have the right impact. And I think even President Nelson understood that, because in one of the most delightful parts of the talk at the end, he says, many of you are listening to this and saying, oh yeah, this guy's going to have to be nicer to me. Well, I hope they are, but I'm talking to you too. You have to be nicer too. But it's very easy to listen to a talk like that and assume it applies to everybody else and not to you. So I think that's the danger of how it might not trickle down appropriately. I don't think it's in danger of being ignored. I think it's in danger of being misinterpreted. And I think what's happened with the Patrick Mason situation demonstrates that that's happening to some degree.
And Greg, I just wanted to hear your takeaway from President Nelson's speech and what he had to say, and maybe how you're maybe taking some of the principles he talked about and implementing them into how you do things as well.
I probably do have a different interpretation then of his talk. Couple things. First, I think, I follow certain rules on the show. I don't do it perfectly, but I follow certain rules where I don't try to go after individuals. And when he talks about contention, I think that's the number one issue, whether it's a person or a group or anybody else. When you're going after them, what you tend to do is go with ad hominem and character assassination. That to me is contention, and that's wrong. And it doesn't do anything, as he says. What I do, however, is I do talk about issues, and I do talk about principles, and I go through the principles and try to make things aware. I don't necessarily always argue for my opinion, although I do sometimes. I think that's an important distinction. There's always going to be conflict. Conflict is going to exist. We live in a temporal world where there's adversity and opposition in all things, right? It's just always going to exist. It happens in your marriage. It happens in your family. It happens with your friends. It happens at work. There's always conflict. And, what is it, 2016, here's another quote from President Nelson. He said, stand up and speak up for truth, especially when it's not popular. Now, how do you reconcile that with, get rid of contention? Well, I think the way you do that is you say, number one, the person opposing me or that I'm opposing is a child of God. They have value. That's the number one issue here that I always have to keep in mind. But there are times where I think you do need to stand for what you believe in. Getting rid of contention does not mean getting rid of conflict necessarily. Getting rid of contention does not mean tolerating everything, right? It means keep in mind who you're talking to and the value of that individual and the value of that person or that group or whatever it is, and stop trying to other everyone, right? I think beyond that, the Come Follow Me chapters this week, there's well, let me back up. I think of the idea of John the Baptist, right, that we can all relate to. Where is he? He's out in the wilderness crying repentance. He's not in Jerusalem, right? He's not going to do real well in the middle of Jerusalem crying repentance. He's forced out into the wilderness because he's standing for something that a lot of people at the time in the power structure there are not going to want to hear. So he has to go out to the wilderness, but he's also not in a hermit out there. He's still preaching, he's still opening up, and he's inviting everyone. And I feel that a lot, that really applies to this relationship that I'm trying to build with Jeff McCullough and other evangelicals. I don't know if you know who Del Tackett is. I've got a 7-part series with Del Tackett, who is, he was a senior vice president of Focus on the Family. He's the author of the Truth Project and the Engagement Project. He was in the Bush White House. And that's an incredible thing for me, that he would come on a Mormon podcast for a 7-part series is pretty amazing to me. But thinking about that, it's like, look, if I'm going to stand and speak up for truth, especially when it's not popular, as President Nelson says, I believe in doing that. And even if it is going to cause conflict with those that disagree with me, but I'm not going to try and be contentious, if that makes sense.
I think that's the key thing, is that this is the idea is we can come to the table with our disagreements, acknowledge them, and talk through them, and not make this into a battle royale where it just becomes a blood sport. It's counterproductive to anything that we're trying to do. And this is the thing, too, is one of the early things that the Lord showed me when I first started this channel is God kind of placed me in a place where, okay, I'm in the sidewalk, I'm holding up my sign, my protest sign, and then there's some people on the other side of the street, they're holding up their protest signs. And God said, just remember that person on the other side of the street is a fellow image bearer. Just remember, whenever you get contending with somebody and you get angry with them, just remind yourself, Steve, fellow image bearer, and operate under those principles. So there are times when, listen, I've had Satanists on my show. I've had atheists. I've had progressives. I've had conservatives. I've had feminists. I've had, you name it, almost the entire political spectrum has been on my program. In every one of these conversations, I can talk to anybody from Aaron Ra, one of the biggest atheists on YouTube, to Rod Meldrum, one of the more conservative members in the Restoration, and all would come across saying that they were given a fair shake and they were treated fairly because they were given the chance to just tell their story. And I look at it this way. Look, everybody knows there's been some controversy happening with the whole Peter Pan, Mike Parker thing and all that. And that became a matter of just because I saw things that were not, there was lies that were being, or misrepresentations that were happening, that I was the person that caught out. So I'll still call out people if they're doing wrong actions or malevolent actions and stuff like that, that you do need to call out people, but still doing it in a loving Christian way. And I think that's the most important thing, is because what we forget so often, and when I deal with some of these people who attack me, they're so-called Christian. I've had Christian apologists, LDS apologists go after me, but they don't I don't see any fruits of the Spirit when they're attacking me. And I'm just like, I go back to them and say, listen, I love you. And I don't see why, because we have disagreements on opinions, that you feel this need to attack me. It doesn't make any sense. And so that's been kind of my journey as well. And for the most part, folks, 99% of the time, the feedback I get is very, very positive. There are a few people who don't like me from the evangelical side as well, some factors within the Restoration. But these are minority fringe people as far as I'm concerned. But I also think that it's important that when I talk to these evangelicals who are the types that attack, that say they're a cult, and they're the people that are holding the signs up at General Conference. Man, people who are LDS folks, they don't want to have, they're like, if that's evangelical Christianity, I don't want to have anything to do with that. And so that's what I love about this work that we're doing. Like with Greg, I really appreciate what you're doing with Jeff, because I think that's so important, because we are modeling the behavior. And that goes back to, on February 9th, I interviewed John Dehlin in his studio for my channel, in which sometimes in the near future, it was supposed to be this Monday, but they bumped it up. I just heard from the producer Maven earlier, but it's also going to be aired on Mormon Stories. This one, on February 9th, I'm interviewing him. They just did the temple changes on February 7th. And he was praising President Nelson big time about the temple changes. It was incredible. But then on top of that, he said, Steve, I made a resolution that 2023 is going to be the year where I build bridges and not do contention. This is John Dehlin. Okay. And one of his attempts was, one, having people like me on the program, but also doing this weekly podcast, which I thought was so fascinating, because you're going to have Jana Reiss and Patrick Mason, who are both members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and you're going to have John Dehlin, and they're going to do this weekly thing. I thought, what a perfect thing to demonstrate modeling behavior. Unfortunately, Jim, after 2 episodes, and Patrick had to, and I've been in touch with Patrick, by the way. I'm in communication with him, and I just feel so bad about how that went down. As a faithful Mormon member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Jim, how do you feel about that when you see stuff like that happen?
It makes me very sad, because we just don't have any tools to deal with people who leave. We don't have very good models. I mean, this talk by President Nelson is a wonderful step in the right direction. But when it comes down to the real world, all of a sudden people say, well, yeah, but if somebody leaves, they're obviously an evil person. They're obviously wicked. They're obviously Korihor. I mean, I always say this, the Korihor template is the only template we have to apply to people who leave. That we can't imagine the possibility that somebody who leaves is still a person of integrity, is still a person who is decent. Like Rebecca talks about, they're still happy people. They can find happiness, they can find joy even after they leave the church. We just don't allow for that possibility. And so that's a huge problem. So John Dehlin's having a conversation, and a very respectful conversation, with 2 active Latter-day Saints. And the Midnight Mormons do a whole hour about how to make an anti-Mormon podcast, and the whole thing's about how Patrick Mason is just the worst guy in the world because he's talking to Korihor. And so I just look at that and go, guys, the way to really misinterpret what President Nelson is trying to say to us, way to really misinterpret what contention is and what contention means. I've had 14 hours of conversations with John Dehlin publicly on his podcast, where we disagreed about just about everything. And I can't remember a more delightful time than those 14 hours. We both stood for what we believed in. We both, stood up to each other, and did so kindly and respectfully. And I consider John Dehlin to be a friend. And I don't understand how we build the kingdom by demonizing John Dehlin. I don't understand what the positive is. And yet that seems to be our go-to. It seems to be the only thing we do.
So, Rebecca, I want you to kind of weigh in on your thoughts on what you think. And again, this is a broader thing about contention, but we also wanted to address this because this just is a breaking story that just happened a few days ago. What was your reaction to that whole thing happening as well? Because, you're a post-Mormon person and you're navigating this world because you're still very much plugged into it. And I just thought, what a great idea of having 2 members who are very important members of the church, right? I mean, Peggy is very influential, and Patrick is. I tell people that Patrick.
You're conflating Peggy with Jana.
Oh, Jana Reiss. I'm sorry.
Jana.
Jana Reiss. I'm sorry. I was just talking about
Both of them are awesome.
with somebody right before the show. Sorry, Jana Reiss. I do conflate them sometimes. I apologize. But you have these two on there, and of course, I tell people Patrick Mason's the guy that when they do the documentaries, when the outside crew comes in, they have the talking heads. They have Richard Bushman, and then they have Patrick Mason and a few others. Patrick is a very public person in that world. So I just thought, okay, this is really a cool idea. What did you think of the whole thing, Rebecca?
Yeah, I watched, I don't know if it was the first or second episode. I didn't even realize that there were two, but I was like, well, now this is a very fascinating, interesting scenario because, you know, I've listened to things that Patrick's done. I think he's an awesome person. Funny, on the post-Mormon side, we all kind of went, John's being awfully apologetic. I mean, it's funny how there are different points of view, right? And then on the other side, and I don't even want to say other side, there's got to be a better way to say it. There's just different points of view. But when we read those tweets that were published from Patrick, I think it was heartbreaking almost to read them. You know, he said that his friends and colleagues had said that he had turned away from them by turning toward someone else. And we just felt that's heartbreaking for him. And I tried to put myself in his position and thought, I wonder if he's just stunned by this reaction. I wonder if he felt like, well, the prophet just said we want dialogue and we want to do this. And then suddenly he's finding out, you know, through friends and colleagues. And of course, post-Mormons were very curious to know, where did this actually come from? Is it just friends and colleagues that are approaching him and saying this is not a good look? I know the Midnight Mormons had said, you know, you're giving visibility, credibility to Korihora, like Jim said. But we were also very curious, is this just some friends chastising him? Does this go higher up? Is this an institutional thing, which is even more problematic? Some post-Mormons I know were very quick to jump on that. Oh, it's straight from the top. They shut him down. You know, that's very problematic if it is that, but no one knows if it is that. It could also just be friends on an individual level going to him and saying, Patrick, you know, this does not look good for your credential, for your reputation. I think the word reputation was used in the tweets that he put out. So I think a lot of us, I had great empathy for him, and I felt like he might have been very shocked and stunned by the reaction, because in his mind, he's just trying to do what hopefully everyone is trying to do. Can't we all just get along? So I felt like he was blindsided, perhaps. I don't know if the rest of you felt that way, but I felt just his tweets were very poignant almost, you know, feeling like, what? I was just trying to, you know, dialogue to build bridges, and it didn't work out that way. So that's kind of a spectrum of conversations I had with other people on the post-Mormon side, but everybody's very interested in it. And everybody's invited Patrick on every post-Mormon show there is to say, come talk to us. Tell us what you're thinking, you know, please, we're here. So I don't know that he's going on anyone's show.
I don't think he's doing it in
no, I don't think so
interviews.
either. And that's fine. But yeah, it's too bad, because there is another news show. It's called the Mormon News Roundup that's been going on for a couple years, where they do have people from all across the spectrum, and they do it successfully, but they're not as visible as John Dehlin and Jana Reiss and
show.
Patrick getting together. Yeah, I mean, you did
on
that show.
So did
I'm
I.
on that show. Yeah, that's what I'm. That's
We've
what
all
I'm
been.
saying.
We've all been on that show.
Everyone's been on that
It's really
show,
funny.
and he's
It's kind of a
able
delightful
to
show.
do it. I wish more people knew about it, because he really does talk to everybody across the spectrum, and they talk about the news, exactly what John and Jana and Patrick were trying. But I think it's under the radar. That's why we can all go on it, you know, successfully. But anyway, those are just sort of some thoughts that I've gleaned, you know, my own perspective from what in the post-Mormon world we're saying. Our heart goes out to you, Patrick, because we see what you were trying to do.
And Kurt Francone also has his weekly program too, and he's a good friend of mine, and he'll be coming on the show. Greg, I want to ask you: have you ever had any interactions with Patrick Mason? Have you ever? What's your history with him?
Not a lot. I like Patrick. I've had him on the show. I've interviewed him. We've had some online discussions on different issues. Look, he's a faithful guy. He's strong in the church. He's kind of a dichotomy in some ways, because I think a lot of people would say on one side, right, a certain side of the political spectrum, that he's actually helped a lot of people stay in the church, right? That he helps them stay in the church. And then there's other people on the other side of the political spectrum that'll say that he's let a lot of people out. And so he rides this, again, edge of the sword kind of position there. And it's very difficult. It's a very difficult place to be. I like Patrick. I will say I didn't agree to begin with. I don't know if I'd even agree, because I don't know really what the show is about, or how it would go. But I was surprised that he went on it. I was. I thought, I don't know how well this is going to work out. Of course, again, that's without knowing how the show was going to be conducted or what kind of dialogue there was going to be. And I said that to some friends. I said, I'm a little surprised, not that it's not a good idea to have the dialogue. I think it's a great idea to have the dialogue, but there's messy and then there's real messy. And I think that this, at least for now, was maybe too messy.
Well, the fact that it only lasted 2 episodes, and it does show that maybe in one sense, people weren't ready for that. I don't know how to respond. I just think that, President Nelson talks about free agency and the importance of being able to use that, which I think is a beautiful concept within doctrine within Mormonism, And so to me, it's almost like if we tell people that you have to stay in a certain box or do a certain thing in order to you have to comply, it kind of in one sense robs people of their free agency as well, and that they should have a lot of freedom to engage. They used to, I remember D.L. Moody went and spoke at the Tabernacle. One of the leading evangelicals of the 19th century came and spoke and met Brigham Young and having people from, and this is the time when evangelicals, the world hated LDS folk. That was, in evangelicals in particular, this was a very contentious times. It just shows that even in the worst of times that we can have engagements with people that we don't care for. And I just felt like, what do you guys say to that? Doesn't it seem like if you put pressure on people they have to conform to a certain way of doing things, otherwise you're in the out group, doesn't that rob people of their free agency?
I don't think it robs them of their free agency, but it definitely maybe persuades, right? Nobody likes to have the fingers pointed at them, and in our social media world, to be in a position where you can be attacked so easily, I go through this all the time. It's not fun. It's not a fun thing, and I was reading, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Jonathan Haidt, but I read a lot of Jonathan Haidt. I love what he does in his work. He's a social psychologist, and he's coming out with a new book that's talking about the conflation of AI with social media. A lot of what he's done is studying teenagers and college students that have grown up with the iPhone. And now he's moved on to where AI and social media conflate. And a lot of what he talks about the Tower of Babel, and how social media has pulled us apart into these different groups, and it's Babel falling apart, basically. And that this AI is going to just exacerbate the whole situation, because it's going to provide greater content, more professional content that continually says the other side is the devil. Mm-hmm. And then you think about the way our news and media is delivered to us now. There's I probably actually I don't watch any news, but I probably look at things very differently than each of you do. So we, the 4 of us here, each have our own silos of where we're getting our information, and what that turns into is a preaching to the choir over and over again, where we're all, the idea of having an understanding among all of us and a common thread of culture, I think is going to be a more and more difficult thing. So President Nelson's talk, I think, is very appropriate in understanding, I think, where things are going to go in our culture. I don't think that we're going to, as a culture, get any better at this. I think it's going to be worse, and I think it's not just going to be 2 sides. I think it's going to be several.
Jim,
doomsday for the day.
Yeah, it's hey, you know what? This actually is great for our conversations because really this is a broader conversation about the state of our society. Jim, we were just talking about how here you are, lifelong Republican. Your father is a very prominent U.S. senator. You're just a mainstream Republican, and then you wake up one morning and turns out you're this evil progressive that people want to attack, and it's like. What happened here?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about it. Yesterday was 7 years to the day since my father passed away. And there were actually people on Twitter beating up on me saying his father must be rolling over in his grave because of how wild-eyed liberal Jim has become and all of that. And I believe everything I believed when I was a registered Republican. I feel like the party has left me. but I was reminded of the story. My father was dying of pancreatic cancer, and then suffered a stroke, a debilitating stroke that's what really took his life. He suffered a stroke and was dead 3 weeks later. And we all gathered around his bedside in Washington. He was at the George Washington University Hospital. And he turned to me, and he had the difficulties of speaking that come after a stroke. But he turned to me in his bed and he just said, "Are there any Muslims in this hospital?" And it was such a strange question. And I thought, this is probably brain damage from the stroke. Thankfully, he never manifested any of that. He was clear right up until the day he died. But he said, "Are there any Muslims in this hospital?" And I said, "I'm sure there are, Dad. You know, we're in downtown Washington, D.C. And he said, "I want to go up to every single one of them and apologize on behalf of the Republican Party for Donald Trump." And I mean, I don't want to get political here, but the thing was, at the end of his life, it was the division that he was seeing in the party he loved. He was the one who was demonized as the rhino. You know, he kept saying, "I've spent 60 years of my life in the trenches of Republican politics, and suddenly I'm the Republican in name only." You know, and he was the one that was tossed aside by the Tea Party because he just wasn't sufficiently conservative, despite being in party leadership, despite having a 70% approval rating among Republicans. He was the one that the party sort of turned on overnight, and all of a sudden, "You're a communist," Bob Bennett. So when people tell me, "You know, I think your dad would be mad at you," I'm like, "No, I think Dad and I are good. I think we're okay." But you know, those kinds of divisions, that kind of tribalism, was really interesting to me because I had worked in Republican politics, and then for whatever reason, I was approached by Sam Granato in 2010, who was the Democratic nominee for the Senate seat that Mike Lee won, for my father's Senate seat that is now Mike Lee's Senate seat. And getting to know Sam, I went, "Well, I really like you more than I like Mike Lee, but I can't work for you because it'll be embarrassing to my father." And he says, "Oh, we don't have to tell anybody." Yeah, right. You know, within a week, I get a call from Paul Raleigh at the Salt Lake Tribune saying, "We're running a story about you working for a Democrat. Do you want it to run with or without a quote from you?" And I ended up getting more press than Sam Granato did in that race. But the thing that did to me in a political world was, when you work in politics, and this translates into the church too, when you work in politics and you become a true believer in politics, the other side isn't just wrong. The other side is evil. I mean, you're seeing that. I mean, you're seeing these polls that it's like, what do you want most in a Republican nominee? We want one who's going to own the libs. We just want one that's just going to, you know, I used to, as a Republican, love to watch election results come in when Republicans were doing well, not because I cared about the election results as much as I enjoyed watching George Stephanopoulos' face fall. Saw the results come in, and you know, the more unhappy the media was, the happier I was, you know. Mm-hmm. And then I was working for a Democrat, and I was working with wonderful people, and I went, "Well, I don't agree with these guys, but they don't seem evil." You know, and all of a sudden I was like, this whole tribalism that I had embraced professionally as a Republican, I thought, boy, this is a huge, huge problem. And you're seeing it nationally, you see it politically, and you're seeing it in the church. The church, there's a passage in the Book of Mormon that has always, I think, is prophetic, where it talks about the Nephite nation right before the coming of Christ. The entire Nephite nation collapses, and they are all divided into tribes. And the entire nation just becomes a collection of tribes fighting against each other. And I see the Book of Mormon to a large degree as a metaphor. These are people preparing for the first coming of Christ. We're people preparing for the second coming of Christ. And those kinds of divisions, those kinds of tribal relationships that take precedence over everything else, that is definitely where we are going as a society. And it's definitely where we could be heading as a church. We've gone down the road too far in the church. And I thought President Nelson was very much pulling us back. And so I think the pushback to Patrick Mason is that kind of tribalism. It's like, you're turning your back on us. No, I'm not. No, but you're turning your back on the tribe. The tribe is demanding loyalty and fealty, and just even having a conversation with John Dehlin is saying you're not taking your tribal loyalty seriously enough. And that's, I think, really, really dangerous. I think those kinds of tribes within the church, having the kind of factions that we have politically, you're starting to see that in the church. You're starting to see politics seep into the church. I'm always amazed at how many people are Republicans first and Latter-day Saints second. You see that an awful lot, and these kinds of divisions are really, really troubling. And I'm so grateful that President Nelson recognizes that, and I'm very disappointed that Patrick Mason's tribe isn't willing to allow him to follow President Nelson's counsel.
You know, I have to say, as an evangelical Christian, we kind of have a similar thing where I think, I was involved in politics for a very, very long time, and I was actually part of the Christian right. I met Ralph Reed from the Christian Coalition, and my dad was on one of Pat Robertson's TV shows when we went out to Virginia Beach, Virginia. So I was really plugged into that world, and I have to say that in one sense that the Christian right won, and the political cultural war in many ways. It's pretty remarkable what's happened. And there's a lot of things that I'm fine with, coming from more of a right of center thing. But I also think that we kind of sold our souls a little bit too, as a movement. And we've become so tied in with Republican politics that I think that it does hurt us. And I also have to say that, the left politics is also become their religion in many ways too. And so you see like a secular religion that is politics. And so now we have these two competing factions that are almost like it's not only just it's not a civil political thing anymore. It's a cultural thing. It's a religious thing. And it's so sad to see our country being torn apart at the seams. We're all to blame for this. I don't put this on anybody, any particular party. This has been set up for a very, very long time. These culture wars have been with us all along. They've just been under the surface, just there. And now it's just exploded. And I think that as Christians, we need to step back and say, where is the golden rule? Where are the fruits of the Spirit? How as a Christian, can engage people in a way that I don't agree with, but I can still love them? And I think that's like the most important thing. Greg, obviously you have a reputation of being in a particular position and stuff like that, but I always kind of respect your game, because you're willing to stand up for your beliefs, which I'm totally cool with that. And you're going to defend your positions and everything like that. But at the same time, I know you and I've had off the record conversations where you've kind of had concerns about what the kind of culture that's being created as well, on both the right and the left. I think we all have to kind of step back and try to turn our hearts back to Christ.
Yeah, I think with Jim, what Jim said, and Republican first and members second, or disciple of Christ second, I think that goes the same with progressives. I think the political identities that's going to be the biggest battle, I think, for the church on the entire spectrum. And it's very difficult to manage because, again, those feedback loops that we're all in. I'm watching Fox News every night. I'm watching MSNBC or CNN every night. It becomes your life. It becomes you're listening to these things, 1,000 times more. And what you pull on social media 1,000 times more than what you are on the general conference talks or reading the Book of Mormon, right? And so it is an uphill battle. It's going to be very difficult. I do think that there was a political culture war that was won by the right back in the 80s at that time, but I think the left now has won the political culture war, and that they stand. If you look at the institutions and the government and everything else that's going on right now, I think the left has really taken charge in those places. And regardless of what side of the spectrum it's coming from, another talk that President Nelson gave that I think was very poignant in this time is talking, what I call the President Nelson's identity hierarchy. He goes in and he talks about, look, we are first children of God. We are second, children of the covenant. And third, we are disciples of Christ. And that applies to the mostly membership, but I mean, that can apply to post-Mormons to a certain degree as well. And it's like, look, realign your hierarchical identity, who you think you are. This pull on identity, and we can look at identitarianism as a whole right now and what's happening in the culture right now, where all of these, what I would call lesser identities, are being championed, whether it's our sexual orientation or our gender or anything else. Look, we all have those things, fine. But when we bring those things up and put them at top, and our focus is on those identities or political identities, instead of child of God, child of the covenant, disciple of Christ, you've turned the hierarchical structure upside down. And that, to me, Jim, is what breaks us all into the ites, right? Into the tribes that the Book of Mormon talks about.
Rebecca, you had talked about how you've also seen some other things happening that have kind of concerned you, that you wanted to kind of bring out. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I will. And I'd like to just mention, I kind of speak to what Jim and both Greg brought up, the idea of your tribe. We are very hardwired as human beings to have a mythology that binds us together. It's how we survive. It's how we've gotten to where we are. And we're just very hardwired to be wary, suspicious of somebody that doesn't share your myth. It's very difficult. That is what gives us this commonality and just this understanding among people that have your same myth. And so, to Greg's point on AI and social media, of course, it's very easier than ever to find your confirmation bias bubble, right? You can go months without ever seeing any other point of view. If you want, you know where to go and where to find that. So, but the problem with that, and this also goes along with the question that you asked me, Steve, is that with each relationship we have, there's sort of a value hierarchy or proposition to come out of that confirmation bias bubble, to move away from your particular myth and try to meet in the middle with someone. For example, I'm going to try extremely hard with my faithful Mormon sons to find a way to interact and connect and be their mom and love them. A mixed faith marriage, you're going to desperately try extremely hard to find a way that, although you have different, maybe even completely opposing mythologies, you're going to come together. With friends, am I going to try that? I am, to an extent. With people online who, criticize me or come at me, maybe I'll try a little bit, but not as much. So I think you have to take into consideration that value proposition within each relationship and decide, what that means to you. And that definitely informs how hard you're going to try. So that's just kind of my thought on that. And it's different for every kind of person. We had a member of our book club who we interviewed on Mormonish, and we just released it this morning. She's the mom of a transgender child, and she simply spoke, her own life as a parent, navigating that. Her husband's a bishop, inside the church, back and forth, the different tribes, the different mythologies. She talked about her own experience. Well, it's only been up for a few hours, and she's been sending me text after text of her social media site, attack. I mean, and she's just basically telling her own story. So that's a reality, that people on either mythology, either tribe is going to face. And so I think what you were referring to, Steve, was the situation with the BYU professor, a very similar situation where she's a family marriage professor. I had to take this class when I was at BYU. So you can't graduate without taking a class on family and marriage. And she mentioned in one of her lectures, her family with a transgender child, and how the family navigates that, they come together, they are faithful LDS, and how they navigate this situation. A periodical at BYU picked up and published the idea that she had discussed her transgender child in her family. Mike Lee picked it up, tweeted it out, and I almost think that people have asked me this, he kind of said, really, at BYU? I kind of feel he was just being a little clickbaity, maybe there. I don't think he meant
Mike Lee,
possibly to, yeah, I know. It's a weird, but I don't feel maybe I'm giving him too much of a benefit of the doubt. I don't feel like he meant, he could not possibly have known what would happen, because now this woman basically receiving death threats, from that faction of her tribe that says there is no way that you should be talking about this. Now, BYU is standing behind her, saying she followed all the guidelines. You can talk about this issue as long as you don't promote it. So again, here's BYU, the church, basically standing behind her. But like Jim mentioned, this faction, this tribe, this particular mythology has decided to attack her extremely publicly for just talking about her family life. So, what do you get from that? This again, along with Patrick Mason, happened just a few weeks after President Nelson came out and spoke. So again, it's a little disheartening, I think, to see what this woman, a faithful Mormon, is going through for talking about her own challenges in her family and how she navigates things. So I don't know if anyone else followed that, but I thought it was a little disheartening.
Well, Greg, obviously, you've done some stuff where you've been critical of BYU, but I also think you would probably agree that even if you agree or disagree with this professor, that death threats are beyond the pale, that's not how we conduct ourselves, in that way. I think it's important that, look, if you disagree, that's fine, but do it in a way that's Christ-like, and when we threaten violence and these kind of things, that's very hurtful and very unchristian as well.
Well, of course, that's beyond the pale. I will say that if those are coming, they're probably not from the tribe within the church. I'm just going to guess. I've seen this happen oftentimes when a national media picks up on things like that. You're going to get just all sorts of characters, unfortunately. And I've had the same thing happen to me. I had another BYU professor that I did a story on, and he had some death threats, and I guarantee it was not from my followers. It was picked up by national media, and that's where that came from. So yeah, of course, it's beyond the pale. It's ridiculous. And I've done a lot on BYU, a lot of things that I personally don't agree with. That's where I'm kind of standing up for what I believe in. But it's very rare for me ever to bring up a professor's name, right? And so you get on one side, you have the idea of, let's bring out the torches and the pitchforks, and let's go after this individual, because we all love to have that short-term feeling of, the scapegoat. We took care of this. Right. And BYU is doing the right thing, air quotes here. But, with what I do with BYU, that to me, there are so many additional systemic issues there that it's not going to make any difference to go after a single professor or anything like that. I will say with this professor, she's a sociology professor. I've done something on her previously a couple of years ago where she wrote an article about her and her son, and it was a little bit different. There is a little bit of a backstory on that. In the spirit of not being contentious, I'm not going to go into that right now. But again, it's not easy. I mean, it's when you've now got a voice. It used to be the media only, the TV media, the big newspapers, where they've got their policies and procedures, how they're going to follow through their checks and balances and getting a story out. And now you've got anyone in the world that can get a microphone and get on YouTube and say things. And we all have access to these individuals, and they have access to us in a sense. And so it's hard. I will just tell you, I mean, and you guys probably all know this, it is hard work to try and walk the tightrope on all of that. It's difficult because you're going to get bashed all the time. And I get bashed from the left, I get bashed from the right, I get bashed from non-members, from members. Like, you have to get used to it.
Yeah, and Jim, of course, you've been in the limelight too, and I think let's speak to this too. We the moral obligation that we have as people that have platforms, that we make sure that, one, we give correct information out, we don't spread lies, that we try to have integrity, and we don't use our platforms to sow disinformation or discord, but to actually have conversations where we actually move the ball. Whether you disagree or not, like I said, most of the people I have in my program I disagree with, but we have productive conversations. So maybe let's talk about the responsibility of actually having these platforms. Jim, you're just launching your podcast, but of course you have a platform in that you go on many programs as well. Just as being semi-public people, maybe speak to our moral obligation to be also model this type of behavior that we can do, like President Nelson said.
Yeah, my responsibilities as a D-list Mormon celebrity. That's the label my son has given me. I shared that yesterday.
Can I have your autograph?
Yeah. Well, you don't get the only time I've been asked for my autograph was I was at a wedding reception, and this guy was just sort of following me around and looking at me weird. And I'm like, who is this guy? This guy finally comes up to me, really nervous, and he says, are you the guy who was in the movie The Home Teachers? And I am. I'm in that movie. I'm the first person that gets home taught. It's a terrible movie. It was really fun to make, but it's a really stupid movie. And I'm like, yeah, that's me. Can I have your autograph? Like, boy, you sure. I have one fan of my movie career. One movie, one fan. So I guess it's nice. But yeah, it's interesting because as I've sort of put myself out there and put myself in the arena, I get all kinds of weird feedback from corners that I wouldn't expect. I get people who when I first went on Bill Reel and talked to him, I got a call from somebody I knew, and I don't want to out him, but he said, it was really fun to listen to you, Jim, because I listened to Bill Reel religiously, and I wouldn't have told you this until after you were on there, but I'm a closet doubter. I don't believe. And I was like, well, I wouldn't have thought that, but he felt comfortable enough to talk to me about that. So it's been really interesting because I sort of came into this world when I wrote my reply to the CES letter, a line by line reply to the CES letter. And when I published that on April 1st of 2016, and in retrospect, don't ever publish something you want taken seriously on April Fool's Day. But I would put it online. The first day I did it, my website sort of completely crashed. I mean, everybody wanted this. There was a real hunger for this. And I was deluged with very kind messages from people who said I had helped them to stay in the church. But what has happened, I still get those messages. But what has happened is since I started talking to people outside the church, talking to Bill Reel, talking to John Dehlin, talking to I've talked to a number of people in and out of the church, even that fun little Mormon news roundup. And what I found is I get more messages from people who say, Jim, I'm out of the church. You did not help me. You did not persuade me to go back to church. But what you did was help me understand my family and friends who are still in the church, and help me appreciate them, help me to be able to figure out ways. And to me, that's the space I want to inhabit now. I'm really less interested in being sort of the fiery Mormon apologist. I'm very proud of everything I said in my CES letter reply. I don't back down from any of that. But the conversation I'm now interested in having is the conversation that builds bridges, because if every member of the church who leaves is a korihor, that means that everybody in a mixed faith marriage is married to a korihor. That's a terrible, terrible model on which to build a marriage. My child may come to me and say, I'm not going to serve a mission, or I'm transgender, or I mean, some kind of thing that's going to take them out of the church eventually, or maybe immediately. If the only model you have is, oh, geesh, well, you're korihor now, so how do I deal with you? That destroys families. And so for me, the thing that I have discovered, I did not realize this sort of bridge building was necessary when I started this with my CES letter reply. I was very much in my tribe and very much defending my tribe and planting the flag and saying, aha, the Mormons are right and you guys are all wrong, and all of that. And as I've gone through this, I've discovered the hunger out there, the need out there is for the kind of bridge building that President Nelson is talking about. And it's bridge building not just between, Republicans and Democrats, or progressives and conservatives in the church, or any of that. It's bridge building between a husband and a wife who believe differently. It's bridge building between children and parents who believe differently. How do we do that? How do we do that without contention? How do we accept and love and embrace our children when they don't think and believe the way we do? And if the only model out there is the korihor model, that's absolutely devastating. And I think it's long-term devastating to the future of the church. We've
You know-
got to find a way to communicate with each other. I mean, the numbers, the brethren can see the numbers. The rising generation is not storming out of the church in this huge faith crisis. Many of them are shrugging the church off like an ill-fitting suit. It's, no, doesn't work for me. Thanks. And I'm going to go on with my life. And the brethren can see those numbers as well as anybody else can. And so I really feel like this talk from President Nelson was a recognition of that reality. And okay, we need shaming, beating up on these people, calling them names, demonizing them. That doesn't work. It never works, as President Nelson says. We have to be able to agree or to disagree agreeably. We have to be able to disagree kindly and with love. And that's where I intend, for as long as I have whatever platform I have, that's what I intend to use it for, is to create those kinds of models and those kinds of discussions.
Well, and that's the thing, you have the core model, but also what President Nelson says, you have these people and they have disagreements or whatever, you need to have the love of Jesus being shown through your actions. And so, Greg, in one sense, with your platform, and you feel it's your priority too, that at the end of the day, you want to make sure that Jesus is also reflected in your program as well.
Sure. I mean, I think that there's, again, can you focus on similarities and not just disparities and differences between the groups? And it's a hard thing to do. I mean, look, I've got Patrick Mason is someone that is probably diametrically opposed to me in many ways in his approach. But I'm not going to demonize Patrick. That doesn't make any sense. I know he's a faithful guy. I know he's a strong member of the church. I know he's a good person. That's not something I want to go after. That doesn't make any sense to me. I would rather talk with him, right, and discuss things and try and learn more about his perspective, try and gain perspective from that. That doesn't mean I have to agree with him. It's like we live in this bumper sticker type of reactionary culture where it's you have to almost be all the way on one side or all the way on the other. President Oaks went over a couple of years ago a talk where he talked about clear thinking. And it's basically, look, you have to be able to find the nuances. You have to be able to analyze what is going on and accept certain things and reject other things. And we're not very good at that. It's so much easier for all of us to just find a tribe and get the positive feedback from everybody. It's so easy to fall into that. I remember when I was starting off with my podcast, and I've probably got more people that would lean right that listen to my podcast, I'm sure I do, than would lean left. And I remember early on, I mean, for the first time, because I'd never done anything like this, or it's been a long time anyway since I've done anything like this, where I was a public figure. And I thought, God, this would be so easy to just feed it, just to keep feeding this, it would feel good. I'd probably grow faster, it would just be, it'd be more energy, a specific energy. I think it's a hard thing to be able to push that off and say, you know what, I want to just say what I think is right. I want to do what I think is right. And I want to use the love of God and charity with those that are around me whenever possible, right? Whenever possible.
Yeah, I think that's great, Greg. And, that is very true. There's a lot of people who did make that choice to go that direction, and just they're adding more heat than light to the matter, and they're not helping us have these positive. I think like today is a positive conversation. And one of the things I wanted to, with Rebecca is too, just a little over 2 years ago, you were in charge of this little book club with maybe 15, 20 people in a Zoom call. And this little evangelical interloper hops into the call, wants to start talking to you. And you guys are like, what is this evangelical? Whatever. Okay, well, it's for everybody. And when you think about your first appearance on my program, how big of an impact that had on people, a lot of people came out. And I think one of the things I didn't realize when I did this channel was the impact you have on individuals' lives. When they send you an email, I mean, I get emails quite often from people who say, like, your channel really touches my life, or your channel is like a church service to me. I have very, very conservative LDS folk who love my channel, and I have progressives and people who have left the church who their shelf broke and they're trying to put pieces together, and they're like feeling like they're getting ministered from me. And I'm not intending on this to be happen. So that's the crazy thing when you think about it, is the impact that we have on the individual level of hearing from people. And so that's also the responsibility that we have too, Rebecca, is that we hear from our people now. And we recognize that we nobody knew who we were a couple of years ago. Now we have these platforms, and we're directly affecting people's lives in a way that I still can't quite comprehend. What do you say to that, Rebecca?
Yep, you're absolutely right, Steve. And I was going to say that, I'm a post-Mormon and I'm your co-host, right? And we talk
Right.
to all kinds of different people. And when you talk to people who are also post-Mormons, you often echo what Jim sort of just said, which is, would you, my faithful viewers, like to understand more about your friends and family members who may be gravitating away from your religious traditions? If you would, listen up. So through that lens, you can have those discussions. We had the guys from Was Mormon on. They have created a website where you can go and learn about why people leave. Post-Mormons put their stories there. And that was sort of the lens that we discussed things with them. So it wasn't, I don't think, frightening to your faithful viewers. It was really like, like you said, are they just a Korahor, or is there a story? Is there a reason? Is there a person going through something that you might want to understand, especially if it's a family member? So to me, that is the most important thing. And I love that on your channel. And then on my little podcast, Mormonish, I feel the same way. One of the biggest compliments I got just came in a couple of weeks ago. We interviewed a woman who was putting on the Women's Thrive conference next month, and she wanted to get the word out. This is a support group for post-Mormons, and this is a women's conference. So she came on and she told us all about the conference, and then we aired the episode. And she shared with me that she had shown the episode, and my program is definitely a post-Mormon, very progressive, nuanced Mormon bent. She had shared the episode with her very faithful LDS mother, and she said, we watched it together. And my mom said, well, they seem awesome. That seems wonderful. We love what you talked about, and everything was fine. So huge compliment to me that, and what we're trying to do. And I know it's not always possible. I also agree with what Greg is saying. There are points where you do have to retreat to your tribe and your myth and say, I'm going to push back here. But in the places where you can agree, like Greg also said, let's agree in those places. Then it just makes it better for everyone. And especially if it's a family member, a close friend, you need to try even harder to find those areas where you agree more than where you disagree. And I think that's what we're all trying to do on our various platforms of various sizes.
That's great. I love it. And of course, Jim, you're starting yours up. I also want to mention too, folks, this is actually a good book. We had John Ogden on, When Mormons Doubt a Way to Save Relationships and Seek a Quality of Life. And what I love, his approach in this book is so wonderful, because he actually will tell a story of a person that had a negative experience with the church, but also gives the story of the person's reaction who's a faithful Mormon. He's trying to give the different perspectives, which I think is important, to try to put ourselves in the other person's shoes as well. And then I do this as well because, I was an atheist for a really long time, folks. So I know what it's like to lose one's faith. And it ain't easy. When I had Don Bradley on my program, I talked about how people don't realize it, that when you lose your faith, when you leave your faith, you lost your best friend. And that's devastating. And so to me, that's where the compassion comes in, to know what it's like to experience the hurt and having the PTSD that I experienced from religious trauma and spiritual abuse. And so to me, this is why these conversations are so important, because even if somebody's left the tribe, they're still an image bearer. They're still a child of God. And so it really bothers me when I see this stuff happen. It really breaks my heart. It really does. And because I think it's important that we love each other and listen to each other and put ourselves in the other person's shoes as well. Because, Lord, I've had a heck of a life. I've had a really difficult life, okay? It ain't easy growing up as a gay kid in an evangelical world that's very much against you, okay? It's not easy. And I just know what it's like to be the other. and be on the receiving end of these things as well. I'm sorry, I don't mean to break down, but this is why this is so important to me.
I wish I had a Kleenex, Steve. I would hand it through the. You've got one.
You got one. That was lovely.
Oh.
Well, okay.
You
All
left
right.
us hanging a little there, Stephen. I don't know.
I'm sorry. I didn't expect to have that happen. It does. I do cry. Rebecca cried once too, and she never cries on the show.
I will never admit it, but I cried over the Mountain Meadows. I'm sorry. It's the only time.
But yeah, that would certainly be something to cry over. Well, folks, I want to hear from the audience. I want to hear, what did you think of this conversation? Did you learn something from it? Do you realize, have you been a victim of maybe people attacking you unfairly because you have a certain viewpoint or worldview or the life you lead? Maybe share those stories as well. But also I want for those of you to share stories of maybe hope and reconciliation where you were able to patch things up. We have many stories of people who are maybe on the outs with their family and they're finally able to get healing in their relationships. Maybe talk a little bit about that. Jim Bennett, Greg Matsen, Rebecca Bibliotheca, I want to thank all three of you for coming on. Jonathan Neville, unfortunately, wasn't able to make it, but I think this was a great conversation. What do you guys think?
Great.
I liked
Appreciate it.
So that's
thumbs up.
I think we
This
need
might
to have,
bump me up from the D list to the C list.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
how good
exactly.
it was.
Now you can charge for your autograph once you're on the C list. I
That's
hear.
right. That's
So-
right.
That's great. Well, this was a beautiful episode because we have people coming from different perspectives, but also are able to show how we can do it in a civil, compassionate, Christ-like way. And I think that's what it's all about. So folks, don't forget about the book giveaway drawing. Make sure you participate in that. There's links in the description for those of you who like to financially support us on both Patreon as well as PayPal. And do not forget the merch store where we have hot chocolate mugs, or for post-Mormons, maybe coffee mugs, or for non-Mormons as well. But we have hot chocolate mugs, we have ball caps, we have t-shirts, we have car seat covers, you name it, it's in there. And that's at mormonbookreviews.com. But this is the most important thing, is this, folks. Remember, all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.